Hello and welcome to the Real Estate Macro Podcast. I'm your host, Douglas Dow. I have a special episode for us today, folks. I've got Mark McGrath to join us today to talk about OODA. And before we discuss what that is, Mark, you've done some significant writing in OODA, including your paper, the Adaptive Entrepreneurial Method, VUCA, OODA, and IoT. Before we unpack this fantastic concept that are revolve OODA, can you help that can help investors in all asset classes? For today's podcast, can you tell us about how you got here?
Sure. I first came into contact with OODA in 1994 when I was a freshman at Marquette University in the Naval ROTC program. I had a scholarship to school there and I had a Marine option. And when I graduated, I was commissioned as an officer in the Marines. And from very early in the training, in a class called The Evolution of the Art of War, we were introduced to the concept of what we knew then as the Boyd cycle. And Boyd's cycle was observe, orient, decide, act in a loop, and continue to learn as you go forward. And in 94, John Boyd was still with us. He left us 3 years later, in 1997. And it always made sense to me. And I did 6 years active duty as an officer in the Marines. I was a field artillery officer. Got to see a lot of interesting things and meet a lot of wonderful people. And all the while, you're constantly learning how to apply decisions at the lowest level, delegate decision-making to the people that you're charged with leading in this framework of observe, orient, decide, and act. And I guess you end up getting really good at it or good enough at it when you're in the Marines. And then when I left active duty and I began working in the civilian world, first in medical sales for a little over a year, and then in the asset management business, it really started to hit me almost like a tidal wave, the power of what we had been taught, specifically how to shatter your correspondence with the way things appear to be in order to reevaluate and align your perceptions of what's actually going on. And it kind of came with a perfect storm because I had gotten out of active duty and I had started studying economics in the Austrian School of Economics tradition, which is more or less free market theory. But the core axiom of the Austrian School of Economics came from a guy named economist named Ludwig von Mises, and it's called praxeology, the study of human action. And the action axiom, to me, seemed like a perfect alignment with John Boyd and everything I had learned in the warfighting curriculum that the Marines teach all leaders at every level. And I just went on this path of just years of really weighing that out. I wound up picking up, finishing my grad degree in economics. And the more and more I got into it and the more and more things I experienced firsthand, through observation and going through it with others, like the crash of 2008 and, everything up to now, I kept seeing it appear everywhere. I kept realizing that there's a real strong connection between what John Boyd was saying and what Ludwig von Mises and Friedrich Hayek and some other economists were saying. And I set out to try to marry the two in order to take what I learned from the Marine Corps, and because I was already applying that to my experience in the corporate world. I was in and around markets. I was already applying those principles. And then I saw the sort of academic connection with the economics that I had studied. And that's sort of how the paper and everything came out. But that's really my mission, is to spread these ideas and keep developing them. Because the nice thing about both of those theories, whether it's Austrian economics or John Boyd's theories, is that they're kind of left open-ended on purpose so that we can continue to develop them and apply them and learn. And I think that that's really one thing I love about John Boyd, was that he did leave it open. And both of them John Boyd and Ludwig von Mises got no credit in their own life for doing this thing. And I'm always very quick to point out where I got these theories from, because they got no credit in their own life. Yet at the same time, they're so influential. They're so powerful. And when I think when taught effectively, and I've kind of taken a slightly different tack on how I teach it and work with it with others. I think that it unlocks a lot of the potential that we have to be the best versions of ourselves, both individually and as teams, as organizations, as firms. And with better self-awareness and with better situational awareness, it leads to a lot of power in a good way. And if you're doing it well enough, everybody that you're doing business with should be better off. And of course we can get into that, but that's really my mission. So
it's incredible. And for the vast majority of folks that don't know what OODA is, because I think it took me quite of a rabbit hole to find it, honestly. And for the vast majority of folks that have not studied OODA, can you share us a little bit about number one, what it is, and then how Colonel Boyd developed it?
Great question. So there's a lot of angles to go, even in explaining it, how it started. But sort of the executive summary was that John Boyd was a fighter pilot in the U.S. Air Force, and he started positing why does one side do better than the other in a dogfight. And he had written what's still today the definitive work on air-to-air combat. It's called the Aerial Attack Study, and he wrote that as a young captain. He also was the co-author with another scholar of what's called energy maneuverability theory, which is a formula that's applied to the design of jet aircraft and brought us things like the F-15, the F-16, the F-18, and the A-10. And what he originally set out to do is figure out, one side, people, ideas, things in that order, like one person with an idea and certain types of hardware was able to cycle through the steps of observing, orienting, deciding, and acting and learning, then the opposite side. And as they were learning, their orientation would be updated, augmented, which empowered them to make observations faster and make actions faster, to act on things faster, essentially compressing their time scale, and at the same time elongating and ultimately shattering that of their opponent. And the more that he got into it, the more that he realized that he had discovered or was in the process of discovery a theory for learning that didn't just apply to air-to-air combat. It applied to ground warfare. And then it didn't just apply to ground warfare, it also applies to business. You can observe this in business. And then he says, well, wait a minute, it also applies to conflict of any kind, where humans are, competing, cooperating, collaborating. And it all centers around this idea that he believed that there were really three scientific principles that were sort of rooted in why this theory of learning, which we know as OODA, why it works, or why it was required, was that Heisenberg proved uncertainty, that you can't fix 2 points exactly anywhere in the universe. And these are the explanations of a historian, undergrad, and an economist by master's. So,
I'm with you. I'm like, quantum physics.
Yeah,
interesting, but I'm not sure how much I understand.
The second one was the incompleteness theorem, Gödel's incompleteness theorem, that a system could not determine the efficacy of a system within itself, that there was always going to be incomplete information. And then the third thing was the second law of thermodynamics, which is essentially that a closed system entropy increases, or disorder. And I like to take those three things and just call it VUCA. The Army War College gave us the great term of VUCA years ago: volatility, uncertainty, complexity, ambiguity, which is another way of saying chaos, disorder, uncertainty, the state of things, the state of the universe. So as we navigate through that as individuals and as teams, we orient to it, And if we can align our orientation, our perception, our understanding, the meaning that we apply to things, if we can align that to reality as best we can and continue to update and revise it in order to keep it aligned to reality as best we can, that we would make better observations, better decisions, better actions, and have the capacity to learn faster than our opponents or than the rate of change, market forces, that sort of thing. And in doing that, we would, as individuals or in teams or tribes or organizations or units, we would ultimately put ourselves in a position to improve our capacity for free and independent action. That was the stated goal of his only ever published paper. He published one paper. It's 11 pages. It's about the densest paper you'll ever read in your life, but it lays the theory of what became ultimately OODA loop. He published that paper in 1976, in September of 1976, and then the OODA loop, as we understand it, as we see it in the graphic depiction, that's very common and readily available if you Google images, and it's all over Wikipedia and things like that, or my LinkedIn page.
Right.
You can see that version came out in 1996, the year before he passed. So 20 years of study, but really it was longer than that, because I think that paper that he finished in 1976 was the culmination of several years of very intense unlearning and study. And I like that too, because I say when that paper was published, I was 3 months old. So
and Mark, look, to make sure I'm understanding correctly, so essentially in a competitive game, your objective is you're basically want to turn inside your opponent's OODA loop, essentially. So what the faster your OODA loop is, it's like one way of a competitive advantage, essentially.
So essentially in a competition, it's orientation versus orientation. And that can scale at any level. If it's two wrestlers, it's wrestler A's orientation and wrestlers B orientation. Or if it's two football teams, it's team A's orientation, collectively as individuals and units within a team, and team B's orientation. And within a larger units, it's fractal, and it scales up and down. And essentially the orientation, or the side that can readily identify, figure out what's going on through their aligned orientation, which in turn shapes how they see things, the faster that they can test, create a hypothesis and test those hypotheses, which hypothesis would be a decision, and learn from that, and more importantly, adjust. Whoever can do that the fastest and have the tempo to continue to do that will outperform the other. Where one's OODA loop per se, or where my orientation becomes disconnected from reality and I'm static and I focus on, hey, they're running a 3-4 defense and not a 4-3. We planned for a 3-4. No, we're sticking with it. We're gonna double down. We're focused on this, and my orientation doesn't adjust, and I continue to get the suboptimal results as I continue to observe, orient, decide, and act. Eventually my OODA loop slows, because the competitor that recognized what was going on is able to see things faster and act on those things faster, and essentially outpace their opponent. And one caveat to tell people that are tuning in and listening, I mean, you never stop learning when you're going through this. This is continuous learning. And just like OODA, it's demanding, the orientation, we're demanding it. We're constantly learning and updating it and revising it in order to stay effective. But competition would be one way. And any competition where there's a winner and a loser, we could go through and analyze using OODA and start to explore where an orientation became disconnected from reality, and where adjustments were not made, such that over time the decision cycle degraded, where the other ones began to accelerate.
And it seems like you got observe, orient, decide, act. It seems like to me maybe the first two O's carry most of the freight, but maybe even this the first though. Can you tell us a little bit how VUCA interacts with that? Because I've never heard of VUCA before, and how
Yeah.
does that interact with the loop itself?
So my general thesis when I meet with a group, or a leader one-on-one, when I'm explaining this, I have three immutable points. Point number one is VUCA, that the universe, the state of the universe in its natural state, is volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. And it always was, it always is, and it always will be. And the thought that you could eradicate it, the thought that you could eliminate its effects, is delusional.
Yes.
Rather, point two, if we orient to that and we accept that, then we're able to harness it to our advantage by shaping better observations, decisions, actions, and learning with an aligned orientation to the realities that are posed continuously by VUCA. So point number two is orientation in OODA. And then the third component is that all actions that emerge from our process of OODA are in order to, IoT. In order to is the military way of saying because, that all action is purposeful. And this is where I really tied it in with the praxeological, the human action axiom that Ludwig von Mises posited, that all action is purposeful action. All action, the very fact that humans act, suggests uncertainty, again, which ties back to VUCA. So if we can really, it's very theoretical, but only I try to keep it very simple such that I can hit those three theoretical points and we can move on to application, because those things will never change. Everywhere you go is going to be volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. OODA only applies where humans are making decisions and acting, which, tell me where they're not,
Right.
I mean, that's everywhere, right? And then all action has to be, the third part, all action has to be directed towards intent, mission, purpose, why. That's how I sort of go about teaching it, because I think what ends up happening, and I've observed this a lot, that when we reduce OODA to some sort of a mental model or some sort of an overlay that I would use in certain scenarios, I really think we're understating its potential power of what it can unlock for an individual and for a team of any size. Because when we understand that orientation, as you say, carries the freight, orientation carries all the freight. Orientation is what observes. Orientation is what decides. Orientation is what acts, and ultimately what learns and is challenged to be aligned with the way things go. So I differentiate the discussion with OODA as it's not a tool. It's not something you use. It's something that you're doing all the time anyway, whether you accept it or not, or whether you know it or not, or whether you care about it or not. And my other thesis is that the better we understand how it works and how it's shaped, how our observations, decisions, actions are shaped by orientations, that we can improve our capacity for free and independent action.
Mark, you wrote about in your paper really incredible leadership principle. By the way, this is an advertisement. I have always respected members of the military and why people should hire military service members who have military experience. Leadership is like literally something they teach maybe better than anybody in the world. One of the things, the leadership principle that you mentioned was people, ideas, things in that order. Can you unpack how that interacts with your teachings on OODA?
Yeah, that's a great question. So just to amplify your point about the military and veterans, there's a lot to learn, and every veteran has a story. And not every, I put up a post the other day on Veterans Day, about asking questions and learning more about people's service in order to learn from them, because a lot of veterans I know are like walking history museums. They're also like walking procedural experts and operational experts, so there's a lot of principles and things to learn. So thanks for that.
For sure.
as it relates to people, ideas, and things. So that was Boyd's order, that could never be violated. And you mentioned leadership. So leadership in the military is a quality first and foremost. It's a trait that we all possess, develop, nurture, do our best to be to constantly get better at it. So we're talking leadership, the quality, not the position. And any leader at any level has to understand that they're in a people game. John Boyd said that wars don't fight, or machines don't fight wars, people do. And they use their minds with ideas, which in turn, maybe they'll use things. He classified, think of it this way, with people, ideas, and things. He classified looking at warfare, not just strategically, operationally, and tactically, but looking at it physically, mentally, and then morally. And the moral war, the moral aspect of it was the most important component, and that's inside of our orientation. You know, everybody's orientation is unique. That's the people part of things. You know, if you're in business, you're in a people business, period. You have people that work with you, it's people first. The military is people first. It's where organizations in any industry have violated that order. That's where the problems start to come. That's where we start to build systems or create environments that are they're not designed for human flourishment, you know, human achievement, because we try to retrofit people. You know, we get a thing, we build an idea around it, and we try to retrofit our people to it. Or we have an idea, so we get a thing, and then we try to retrofit our people to it, rather than say, you know, we have people, they're here and they're committed to this mission. And that's how we came together to form a company or a Marine Corps or a baseball team or anything. We subscribe to these ideas, these principles, these theories, etc. And we're going to apply those through the ideas that we have around X, you know, real estate or football or whatever. And then we're going to use these things. But as long as you keep that order straight and you realize that only humans act, that's how we I think do better in the long run, because everything's a people business. You know, sales is a great example. You know, it's all a people business, and that's how that is. And again, the violation of that order is when you start to do things without thinking about your people. You know, the Marine leadership principles, you know, there's one is mission accomplishment, but two is to know your Marines and look out for their personal welfare, take care of your Marines. And because it's a people, it's the people, it's the Marines that make the Marine Corps, right? That's the people. It's not the Harriers and the F-18 Hornets and the rifles and the field artillery and that sort of thing. No, it's the Marines, which are the people. And I think a lot of other organizations could learn from that. So.
That's an interesting question that comes to my mind. There are certain people that are like, my brother is naturally a better leader than I am naturally. In terms of modeling leaders, what are your thoughts on born versus learned? Because I find that interesting. A lot of people might believe that, well, you're either born that way or not, and I disagree. But I believe you can model great leaders. And what comes to mind when you think in terms of modeling leadership?
I've given that one a lot of thought over the years. I think there's certainly both. I think that there are born leaders. At the same time, I mean, I know some very adept students of leadership, and I always try to model after that, because I think leadership to me is something that you could be born with, but maybe it's you're born with the potential, and then you have to develop it and learn and understand how to make it better. I don't know. I mean, in the Marine Corps, every leadership is a quality that's expected of everyone, and everyone displayed it differently in their own way. And
because I find it fascinating, the difference between, like, even looking at World War II, the difference between Chester Nimitz, who was very low key, he was very cared very little about credit, and then MacArthur, who was very much of all about credit. And it's so interesting how Roosevelt either intentionally or unintentionally kind of put them in the same theater and see how that played out. That was very interesting to see how that worked.
So I think that's more of a question of style and approach. And I've seen the gamut of those. There's proactive leaders, there's reactive leaders, which usually is not, to me, in my assessment, is not as ideal as a proactive leader. There's leaders like a George Patton or a Douglas MacArthur, as you mentioned, that are big talkers, but in both cases, they're also
Big action.
Yeah, very big walkers. So, they managed to pull that off. That's, by the way, I'm sorry, the sunlight is like
no worries.
Coming in. See if I can put up there we go.
Yeah, it looks good.
Something to block that, but so I don't know. I think that it's an art for sure. It's both an art and a science. And some are better at one than the other. There are a lot of soft skills that I'm just gonna tape a piece of paper up on this thing. See, I'm using my OODA loop right now.
There you go.
Okay. We just saw an example of OODA loop as the sun was beating into my camera there. And I improvised, adapt, and overcome. But yeah, so we're talking about the different leadership styles. I mean, I think it's just a question of style. I can think of mentors of mine that I still am in contact with regularly, and they all have very different styles. I think where they would have most of the similarities is that they're sound and solid on the core principles. And I think their delivery probably has more to do with just, who they are as people, who they are as individuals. But generally speaking, I think that the principles are the same, and their ability to influence and coordinate action with others is very similar, though their delivery might not be.
And in terms of this is kind of off kind of a shift a little bit in terms of, I find it fascinating. You went from kind of like the people heavy leadership oriented to asset management, where it's just a different opportunity to use the same model in a different way. And I find that fascinating, how it was useful to you to switch up like that.
I think anybody involved in any kind of market, stock, bonds, futures, real estate, whatever, it doesn't matter, it's very simple and straightforward to explain it in the concept of VUCA. They get it. Markets are, riddled with anomalies, right? They come out of nowhere with sometimes violently, with no expectation, or something didn't fit the model or didn't fit the fundamentals. And I guess as I progressed through that, and I had some very good mentors at every firm I've ever been at. I had excellent mentors and people that really showed you the ropes, and got to work with a lot of great practitioners that had been in and around markets for many, many years as portfolio managers and traders and that kind of a thing. The constant fluidity and chaos of it was always very appealing to me, because as a Marine, which is a naval profession, I'm obsessed with the ocean, and the ocean is just like markets. It's somewhat predictable with tides and other things, but then it's extremely unpredictable in the case of weather and hurricanes and tsunamis and things like that. So I always like the fact that that with markets, that they're never the same twice. They're always changing. And it lines up with what Heraclitus said, and Ludwig von Mises quoted this in one of his books, the Foundation of Economic Science, that everything is in a state of flux. You can't put your hand in the river the same place twice. Everything's in a state of constant motion. Everything's dynamic. The world is not static. Markets aren't static. People aren't static. We're complex adaptive systems that are constantly in motion. We're on a sphere that's circling another sphere, and everything's moving, and it's all very dynamic. So mindset should be no different. And I find that with OODA, the best practitioners of any discipline, you could go in and examine, and I would bet that their orientation is more dynamic than those who they're competing against that might look at things myopically or in a static way. So what's cool about this and how I saw the parallels, when you're training for the things that Marines are training for and you're doing the things that Marines are doing, it's all chaos. It's never predictable. And it's not unlike markets at all. So.
And that is interesting. Kind of a running thesis, thanks to Tony Robbins, that human needs have a need for certainty, and it's typically a higher need for most people. So the need for certainty sometimes goes too far, maybe, and it becomes a cognitive error in a sense. Is like their need for certainty so much that they're not allowing for volatility, uncertainty, chaos, and whatnot. And that's kind of, I think, maybe that the thesis I have behind that. It's just such a high human need, but it becomes a cognitive error almost.
I wouldn't disagree with that. I think that's right on, Douglas. If you're doing this well, that certainty, it doesn't exist, period. And I have any number of things to show me that, aside from academics. I mean, nobody has a crystal ball, and anybody that says they do or think that they do is delusional. Now, you can be predictive, right? We can observe patterns and we set expectations, and I think it's prudent to have strong opinions if they're loosely held, because again, back to this Veterans Day post, I had put my post in somebody else's post about they were discussing a certain topic, and I was saying that my own thinking has evolved on this over time, and where I currently think, and then I put my point, because my thinking has changed, and thinking could change, and you should be open to change. And back to orientation and OODA loop, I'll share this with you. So there's three ways that one's orientation, well, there's a lot of, three primary ways that orientation can shift. And they all begin with D, as in Delta. So the first D is drift. All right. I told you I was born 3 months with Boyd's paper, right? 1976. So I'm 46. My 46-year-old self, through drift, the passage of time and age, sees the world much differently than my 16-year-old self 30 years ago, right? Does that make sense?
Absolutely.
So drift can change your perspective. Now, the other two are disruption and design. And the way I explain that one is it kind of goes with Boyd's idea of creation and destruction and creation, or Chet Richardson has pointed this out when Boyd was talking about Cheng and Chi. Like Cheng movements were conventional, Chi movements were unconventional, but basically disruption can shift your orientation very quickly. And the question then becomes, who's going to design what emerges out of that disruption? Are you going to design it, or are your competitors going to design it, or is the rate of change going to design it? If you're competing for something, you're going to have to disrupt, and then you're going to have to meet that disruption with design. So if somebody's not currently working with you, they're working with somebody or something else, you've got to disrupt that connection, and you got to meet it, on the other hand, with design. Another way to say would be like, on one hand I compete, and on the other hand I create. On one hand I create, and the other hand I compete or destroy. There's a couple different ways to say it, but that's how ultimately we shift our orientation. Our orientation gets shifted.
And let me interject something here too.
Yeah.
You sent me a tremendous epistemology of OODA, which was like really mind-blowing to see all the different influences from Eastern philosophy into from thermodynamics all the way to Eastern philosophy, including so warfare by nature was, of course, a big part of it, but also into Eastern philosophy and thermodynamics. So it was like the broad base epistemology is like, and I think in terms of maybe a little bit of the Taleb's concepts of anti-fragile, when you have a philosophy that is so well-rounded in Absolutely. So rounded in based in so many different facets. It feels like it's a robust way of thinking also.
So you hit a lot of great things at once there. I'm gonna try to parse those. So Anti-Fragile, yeah. It's phenomenal. If you find it hard to read, Taylor Pearson has a tremendous summary available through his website on Anti-Fragile. By the way, he also has a very good summary, I think, that's pretty workable on OODA.
Oh wow. Okay.
To your point about the epistemology, I have this with me almost always. It's the evolutionary epistemology, a personal view of John Boyd's destruction and creation and its centrality to the OODA loop, and that's by Chuck Spinney. And you can get this online for free, and he's updated it a few times. It's on Chet Richards' website in the articles section, called Slightly East of New is his website.
And guys, I will actually, I'm going to link that down here in the notes of the podcast as well.
I will tell you this, that this came out, the first version of this came out in 2014. And I would say that that's where really I started to have a lot more epiphanies about the power of OODA. Yeah, because I would labor through destruction and creation. I told you it's 11 pages, but it's not simple. And the value of what Chuck Spinney has done to have as a companion to really understanding destruction and creation, this is worth its weight in platinum. I mean, I mean, you can see my copy is just, I take it with me literally everywhere because, and then I have all the versions digitally on my iPad, but it finally helped me make sense of what exactly Boyd was saying. And then when I went back to read Destruction and Creation, it wasn't as dense. It's still dense, but it made a lot more sense to me. And I think that anybody that really wanted to get good at this stuff from a learning standpoint, from a teaching standpoint, and from an application standpoint, because application is really where you can really, as Boyd would say, you understand these things, your results are going to be geometric. If you haven't gone through Chuck Spinney's evolutionary epistemology, you're going to be lost. And there's several videos of him on YouTube walking through this deck, and I recommend that be included as well.
Will do.
And
definitely.
There's a lot of, I mean, I could go OODA resources. I could give you a million, but that one's really, Chuck Spinney and Boyd were friends. Another friend of Boyd's is Chet Richards. And I mentioned his website, Slightly East of New. Chet Richards wrote a book called Certain to Win, which is about applying Boyd's theories.
Fantastic read, by the way.
Business.
Fantastic.
Yeah, it's very readable. Like it's bigger than Destruction and Creation as a book, but to me, it made a lot more sense.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, I'm completely with you on that. And Greg Bateson, I don't know if you come across any Greg Bateson or not, but very similar thing that I just like literally couldn't understand what he was saying. And one of those works where, okay, somebody else came along, Robert Dills, big NLP guys, these are all the kind of the roots of neurolinguistic programming, came along and started to unpack it. And I'm like, oh, okay, so now I can actually try to get a hold of it, because I mean, literally some of the densest writing I've ever had. And I'm so glad you mentioned that idea, because sometimes it just takes somebody else to come in and translate it a little bit. And I'm glad that resource is available.
Yeah, you hit on something else too. Talk about neuroscience, and I mentioned economics. Boyd was a fighter pilot and also an industrial engineer, an aeronautical engineer. You can come at this from a lot of different directions. And that's the other beauty of this, because remember, human action is it's wherever humans are doing. So if they're engineers or if they're history teachers, right? Everybody is doing this stuff, and you can come to these realizations. I think what it challenges is to be multidisciplinary and sort of maintain a wide range. And by having a wider range and broad curiosity across many subjects, and I mean, if you look at Boyd's reading list, but even the epistemology that you
Yes.
referenced, I mean, you get a feeling that
You're like, wow.
this guy he was not just a pilot and an engineer.
Mm.
He was a scholar that did not limit himself to, any one or two disciplines. He was extremely well-rounded. He studied the Toyota production system. He studied I think one of his favorite books was Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance. And you see on
Yeah.
the epistemology how Eastern thinking and Eastern philosophy was a big influence later in his life. And, I think that following back to your earlier about models, like what leaders to model, most of the best leaders that I've known are scholars too, to some extent, and they're voracious learners, and they're constantly reading and engaging their mind. There's a reason that all the branches do it, but there's a reason that the Marine Corps also had the commandant's reading list, and why at every rank you're expected to read certain books in addition to core books that we're all supposed to read, such that we can continue to build our orientation as we work to become better versions of ourselves individually as Marines, and then also as in our units and as a corps as a whole. But learning and reading and being intellectual and challenging these things and being intellectually curious, that's a massive component. I guess, I'm biased because I am a Marine, but the Marine Corps is the most intellectual branch by far.
Well, in the fact that James Mattis is like a Stoic hero is a prime example. Is like the Stoics that I study, and a lot of the people in that sphere, the contemporary Stoics are like, oh my gosh, James Mattis is like a prime example of Stoicism in embodied, and so it's so incredible how these kind of concepts all tend to. It's weird. They all tend to kind of, there's a way of intersection that's really kind of interesting and bizarre.
I know it's different in today's Marine Corps, just by the nature of technology. Again, drift. When I was in, there were no smartphones. There was no Google like we have it now, and books that were this size. I mean, you could walk around anywhere, out in the field, anywhere, and Marines will have a book in their cargo pocket, because at some point you're going to be sitting around waiting for something. And there was no Facebook, none of that. So what did you do? You pulled out a book and read it. Now, I imagine that, based off of the Marines that I know that are still in, I know that reading is still a very big part of the culture. And I think that that's something too that, in studying OODA, that however you're doing it, whether it's reading in any form, physical books or online, you have to constantly work to continuously upload your orientation. And if you've read Mattis's book, you do get the feeling, this guy is a scholar, and he made a concerted effort to fill his mind with as many different historical scenarios as he can. And I think I don't know the quote exactly, but something along, I'm going to learn from their mistakes. I'm going to study their mistakes so I don't make them, or I'm going to study from their successes so that I can try to model them, or things like that. So,
big time. And it seems like to me, and I've learned this the hard way. I've learned some lessons the hard way about ego.
Yeah.
But learning the painless way is reading as much as possible from as many different places as possible. And it's like, okay, let's not have any mind-altering, life-altering mistakes. Why don't we learn from someone else who suffered and was nice enough to say, please don't do this, because this is what will happen.
So you said ego, and it made me think that one of the characteristics of the best leaders I know, and certainly Boyd and Ludwig von Mises fit this too, humility. And one of the basic humilities that when you approach VUCA, especially in the uncertain part, you have to, this goes back to what I said earlier too about self-awareness and situational awareness. You have to accept that you don't know everything. And the more that you learn, the less you realize that which is a mandate to continue to try to learn as much as you can. Right. But you have to have that humility. You mentioned competition. It's one of the easiest places to look at a vulnerability of a competitor. Do they learn or don't they? And if they don't,
you're just going to clean their clock.
Yeah. If they're not learning, and they're not humble enough to learn, they're going to have problems. And it reminds me, if I've read the book or seen the movie, and I know for sure in the movie it was in The Big Short. they quote, I've seen this quote attributed to both Mark Twain and to Will Rogers, but it says something along the lines that it's not what you don't know that gets you into trouble. It's what you're absolutely positive of that turns out not to be true.
Just ain't so.
Yeah, that just ain't so.
Yeah.
And man, how many times when you examine failure in business and trading and in sports, right? Is somebody was so sure about something and they knew and they doubled down. And then when it didn't work, they tripled down and they quadrupled down. And then they were no longer relevant. You know, they were rendered obsolete by a competitor that operated from a different position.
My first smartphone was a BlackBerry.
It's a great book, Losing the Signal, about
Man, no kidding, right?
Yeah.
You're like,
But it's instructive. It's instructive too. Yeah. And you don't even have to read it to really map out on a whiteboard and explain to people in a group why one failed and why one succeeded. I love the book, $1 Billion Lessons.
I don't think I've taken that one in.
Yeah, Paul Carroll and Chunka Mui,
Nice.
$1 Billion Lessons. But there's a great example in here about Kodak.
Oh.
I mean, it's crazy to think that, like, I remember, I mean, I probably have, if you added all my pictures from college, I graduated college in 98. I probably have, like, between yearbooks and like physical pictures, maybe like 150, maybe 200 pictures that survive, you know. I think of, like, I've taken more pictures than that this past week, you know,
Right.
of, you know,
Yes.
like, and to think that you would not be using Kodak and you would not be taking film into a developer, and and that's what they doubled down on. They tripled down on, and they go through the book and show that, you know, the company that basically invented digital photography was defeated by it because they couldn't get out of their own way, you know.
That's right.
Blockbuster, Netflix.
It'd be fun to ask them one on, hey, will you Xerox this for me and see if they know what the heck we're saying?
Yeah, that's a great one. Or, you know, ask a kid. We try to explain to our kids. I have 4 teenagers. You know, how do you? They get movies now, like clicking a button and bam, you can watch The Godfather, you can watch Top Gun or whatever.
Right.
You know, we would go to my wife and I would meet at Blockbuster. And that was a big deal. Like, you go to Blockbuster and it was like, hey, popping popcorn and they had these big displays, and their orientation. So back to OODA, their orientation was one of a retail experience. Whereas Netflix orientation was one of delivering films to you in your home faster, you know, initially with DVDs that you mail and eventually streaming, and Blockbuster completely disregarded that. And yeah, hindsight's 2020.
Yeah.
But I think if you're challenging assumptions, so John Boyd said, you challenge all assumptions so that what's doctrine today doesn't become dogma. And if you can continuously,
wait a minute, can we repeat that, because that may be such a great statement that I don't think that one should be. That one might be like the episode thesis right there.
Sure. So it's my company, for my LLC. It's my motto is challenge all assumptions. It's our tagline. If anybody wants to follow me on LinkedIn, you can follow me on LinkedIn. And then my featured my featured posts is the Boyd. One of them is the Boyd quote, and he says, you got to challenge all assumptions. If you don't, what is doctrine on day one becomes dogma forever after. And that is, because again, that's the answer, I think, that when people say, well, hindsight's 2020, like, you didn't know. How many people were challenging assumptions then and being told, shut up, you're junior to me, you don't know what you're talking about, shut up, I've been around longer than you, I know what, you know, you're low man on the totem pole, I'm in command, I'm the one who decides. And you go back and you realize that there were some individuals challenging. Not that they had a crystal ball. It's just that they said, well, we've got to do something, or this isn't
working. Yeah, this isn't.
Yeah, we got to make this better. Yeah. I haven't published it yet, but I've always had this article. You know the story from the Battle of Troy where Cassandra was in the temple and her curse, the gods cursed her, like she would tell the truth and everybody would laugh at her and everybody would ignore her. So Cassandra's running around Troy and she's saying, the Greeks are going to invade and Hector's going to be killed, and everybody's looking at her like, you're nuts,
crazy.
Yeah.
Out of here.
and the title of the article would be, "Hey, Cassandra, shut up." Like nobody wants to
Yeah,
hear
you just
Cassandra,
don't.
right?
You don't.
Yeah.
You don't.
So it's amazing what the Greeks teach us. There's so much.
Amen. Amen to that. And
Yeah.
Mark, I want to be respectful of your time here. I really can't thank you enough. This has been such a enlightening episode, and again, I can't wait to learn more from you on about OODA. This is such it's such an incredible uh, tool that we can use and to really integrate into our world in terms of investment and in operating businesses. But even OODA loops even work. You were writing some interesting things even about weight training, how it was even it can even interact in
Mm.
terms of what was going on with weight training. Can you just talk a little bit about that?
So you're right, and it basically personal, professional, anywhere you're making decisions, this applies. With weight training, I'm a big follower and devotee of the starting strength program. Starting strength, the general, so the people, ideas, things. It was started by Mark McGrath. The people who want to get stronger, that's the idea, is getting stronger. And I put it on this post. And then the things that you use are barbells and 5 compound barbell movements that recruit more muscles than isolating them with machines and things like that. So that's a mindset. Now there's a moral, mental, and physical aspect of it. I mean, there's physical, forms I have to have, and things I have to, different cues that I have to think about. But the idea is that the lifter, the person doing the starting strength program, believes that strength is what's going to, stronger people. There's a quote I think that he has in the books, stronger people are harder to kill by nature, and that's
You're right.
when you look at,
Yeah.
humans are organic and we're part of the ecology and we're part of nature, and that's how it's in our coding, is to get strong and in order to thrive. And starting strength is unique because, so back to orientation, with that uploaded in your orientation, I was able to shatter the correspondence of the fitness things I would do up to that I thought, well, I know everything, like I know that this works because why? This is what we did in high school, or oh, this is what we did in college, or oh, this is what we learned in the Marines. I know these lat pull downs and tricep, whatever.
Right.
But starting strength and Rippetoe and the other coaches, the idea is that, well, in reality, where do you go and what do you do where you only isolate one part of your body versus using your whole body, and I think that's the differentiated orientation of why you get different results when you use it. I get people in the gym that are curious about it, and some say, oh, I could never do that. Oh, I'd never do it like that, or I would never deadlift at this age or whatever. But I gave it to my dad for his 70th birthday. So, I mean,
I wondered about that in terms of, I've noticed, and this is just my observation. I've had various goes around with weight training, and I do really enjoy it until I don't. I get kind of burnt out a little bit. But I will say the folks that seem to age really super well have weight training as a part of their weight training, and it seems like yoga too seem to correlate pretty well with
yeah,
aging gracefully.
I know a lot of well, naturally, where I'm from and who I am, I know a lot of former retired veterans, and and a lot of them have been mitigating the various physical challenges that they've had just by wear and tear through barbell training and yoga. Yoga's good too, because there's a physical aspect of it, but I also think there's a mental and like a mental calming
100%.
aspect of it too.
Yeah.
But again, but everything that you're talking about though it's a great corollary to it. I mean, it's orientation, and when you reorient to that, so again, I had to shatter all of my correspondence with previous fitness things I did, and upload and study the starting strength to kind of rewire my orientation. And then what that did as I continue to progress through it is to see things differently. So now my observations are different because I study that program and follow that program, and my decisions and actions are are different. I make a better effort to get more sleep. I make a better effort to make sure I'm eating the right things. And because I don't want to get pinned under a 300 some
really heavy
pound
weight.
squat load or anything like that.
Yeah.
But yeah. And I think the other thing too, the last thing I'd say about that is starting strength is there's actually an article that one of the coaches has written about. If you type in starting strength OODA loop, I can't think of her name who wrote it off the top of my head, but it's pretty good. And basically what it's saying is that these are simple compound movements for your body, which is a complex adaptive system. To go back to VUCA, the human body is a complex adaptive system of systems, really, when you think about it. And the weightlifting system that you bring into your orientation to support those systems, it's all a very systems approach. So if anybody's into systems thinking, it's very much into the one book we didn't mention was Science, Strategy, and War by Franz Osinga. It's Osinga.
Okay.
And in my assessment, that's the definitive book on Boyd. It's he was an F-16 pilot in the Dutch Air Force, and it's his doctoral dissertation on the theories of John Boyd, and it's absolutely phenomenal. And when I read it years ago, that's really where I first came into the understanding of complex adaptive systems as it relates to this kind of discussion.
Right.
Not high school biology class, but
right.
So yeah, that's a must read. It's good. It's not one you probably read cover to cover, but it's one that you take in chunks and read in parts. But that's a definitive book that everybody should have. The only other one I would say is, if we talked about Chet's Certain to Win and Chuck Spinney's Evolutionary Epistemology, is the biography of John Boyd by Robert Coram. It's called Boyd, the Fighter Pilot that Changed the Art of War. It's really
okay.
Good.
Yeah, I don't think I've heard of that one. That one sounds great too. Look forward to getting my hands on that and devouring that stuff.
Page turner.
Yes, absolutely. For a geek like me, for sure. And Mark, thank you so much for taking the time out to do a deep dive today. I really appreciate your time. And if someone wants to work with you in coaching your organization, what's the best way to get a hold of you?
I love LinkedIn. I put all my content on LinkedIn. You can follow me on LinkedIn. You don't have to connect. So anybody could just click on follow. And you can sift through my posts and you can see that, not that this is all I talk about, but it's all I talk about. So
pretty big deal. Pretty big deal.
Pretty big deal.
Good reason. Yeah.
Yep. Mark McGrath. I live in Columbus, Ohio. And I think it's Mark J. J's my middle initial, so I think it's Mark J. McGrath 1 at LinkedIn or whatever. That's the easiest. That's how we found each other.
That's right. Absolutely.
So I think I had commented on something that Tom Basso had put up.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And you're like, OODA? And I'm like, oh, he OODA.
Yeah. He puts someone had tagged you in that. And Tom put something up today. I didn't say OODA per se, but I was talking about firefighting pilots, and I put up did you see my comment on there?
Yes.
Yeah.
That was awesome. Yeah.
Yeah. So, but it's all, he's got a book called Trend Following Mindset that was written with Michael Covell. Michael Covell's books. I mean, I'm a student of trend following. I find that that's a orientation builder for me, having been an asset manager for so long. That was something where it made a lot of sense to me. And you look at you learn about individuals, or if you've ever read the Market Wizard series by Jack Schwager, which Tom is featured in them, and a lot of the other trend followers are, it's all about orientation. Like every time you go through those stories and you read these accounts of all these different investment managers, portfolio managers, traders, they see the same exact thing differently. And we know that in VUCA's ambiguity, right? They're able to interpret it in a different way and apply a different mindset and come up with different outcomes and different results. Sometimes dramatically superior than the market or those that they're competing against. And in every case, you can put the OODA overlay on it and say, when you're looking at, if you're following an investor, or if you're reading about somebody like Tom who's in the book and others, the question, knowing Boyd, you'd say, I want to understand their orientation. I want to understand what's been up, what are their experiences, what's their ability to analyze and synthesize, what's their educational background, what's their psychological state, so that when they look at a certain market, they see an opportunity, whereas others might see a crisis.
Right.
That's how, so I guess when you get into this, that's really, so you start looking at those types of models, talking about leader models, how are they oriented? What did they read? How do they think? Was there anything that they studied that gave them an edge, to look at things differently? So
it is amazing, and trend following is fairly new to me. I've been a big value investor guy, so of course Munger and Buffett really formative in terms of really thinking. Trend following is a new discipline, and I'm really excited to learn more about it because I've seen a lot of good statistical, and also I'm a wannabe quant. I'm not sure if I'm smart enough to be a quant, but I love quantitative aspects of it. So it's like trend following statistically holds up very well. So I'm very fascinated with the rabbit hole on that.
My experience thus far is that you're constantly learning. So like, again, being a follower of John Boyd and Ludwig von Mises, it makes a lot of sense. Interesting that you mentioned Munger. There's a book, pull it off my Munger shelf, Seeking Wisdom from Darwin to Munger.
Yes, that is an incredible read.
Oh, you have it?
Incredible, yes.
So let's talk quick about, so Munger's big thing is mental models.
Yep.
Right. This is a big differentiator between me and a lot of people when we're talking about OODA, and not just me, but there's other scholars in this vein too. We could talk about those too, but OODA is not just some mental model that you apply in certain situations. And if you go through a lot of my posts, sometimes you'll read comments of somebody that disagrees and they say, well, OODA wouldn't apply here. OODA wouldn't apply here. I wouldn't use OODA in this case. But when you say that, the very fact that they even said that, OODA is occurring, right?
Right.
So one of the things I always talk about is, like, say, mental models. OODA, or orientation, is the repository of all of our mental models. So all of our mental frameworks, all of the things that we know about, say, logical fallacies or cognitive biases and all that stuff, all of that resides inside of our orientation. And as we observe and make sense of the world, we're running what we see through our understanding of those various models that are inside our orientation. So it's not like I'm going to choose OODA loop here over something else. OODA is occurring, and I'm cycling through the mental models I'm aware of from wisdom, like Charlie Munger and or anybody else we're talking about, trend following traders or Gerald Mattis or anybody.
Yeah, anybody.
Yeah, that's all updated into our systems. Hunter Hastings and I talked about a lot in our podcast and in the paper that we co-authored, that orientation, think of it as your internal operating system. And remember that orientation as your internal operating system. Remember that we think of internal operating system, we might think of like our iOS and our iPhone or whatever, right? And what happens if you don't update your iOS? What happens if you don't update the operating system of your computer, your laptop, your iPad?
It starts to degrade, doesn't it?
It starts to degrade, and what can it no longer do? It can't isolate and identify threats. It can't maybe do certain functions. Remember, technology mimics nature. Boyd discovered this, how it relates for humans, right? We're constantly updating our operating system, because if we don't, we're not going to see certain threats, or we're not going to be able to do certain things, or we're not going to consider certain things as we're advancing through time. And that could be to our detriment. Somebody say, well, I didn't know, or
Well, in one of the parting shots, I do remember hearing Boyd talk about the difference between being an analyst or a synthesist. So
yeah,
the difference between being analyst or synthesizing stuff, and it goes back to that, taking disparate art forms and saying, well, let's, what was it? He gave a snowmobile analogy, if I remember correctly. It's like, well, you took the bike handle off of a bike, skis from a skier, and a motorcycle parts, and created something else. And it was like, oh,
you
man.
nailed it. Yep, that's
Wow.
it. I remember where I was in the group that I was training a few years ago, and I had put it up on a whiteboard, and you draw 4 quadrants. You put bicycle, motorboat, bulldozer, toy tank, and skier on the slopes.
Yeah.
And then you erase off the whiteboard the quadrants and the domain names, and you have all the component parts, and then you just imagine them all jumbled up. And then the evolutionary epistemology, it goes through this thing in great detail, and it's very self-explanatory. And ultimately what emerges is a snowmobile. And if you look at the post I put up the other day, and I've gotten over almost 25,000 hits on that in less than a week.
Wow, that's awesome.
And it's Boyd, a guy named Dan Grazier, who's a Marine, and he works for a project that I think it's on Defense Oversight. He made that available on his YouTube channel, and I posted it, and I had a lot of feedback from that. And you can see it's the most clicked thing in a week, the most clicked thing I've ever had. And it's Boyd for like an hour and a half himself. The video is grainy, but it's him giving the conceptual spiral brief. And he talks about snowmobiles, on how we shatter the correspondence between something that existed previously and we create something new. That's the synthesis, right? So it's one thing to be an analyst, and I know a lot of great ones because I was, the world that I came from. Yeah, they can tell you, they can break down components, and they can tell you, but okay, great. Now, what do you do? What do you make of that? What do you piece together, and can you create something novel? Something that didn't previously exist, and that's the snowmobile. The Keep Calm, Carry On poster.
Yes.
There's that meme maker, but it's blue and has a snowmobile at the top, and it says Keep Calm and OODA, right? And it's got a snowmobile on it. But that's what we need is winners make snowmobiles. So people that can break things down, they can shatter their correspondence, and they can come up with something new, or they're open to learning new things, which is how I came into trend following, or how I came into Taleb, or how I, came to explore and learn about all these other things, because you're open-minded. That's attempting to synthesize things. That's attempting to, analyze something and then combine it with, like, I guess my current snowmobile that I'm working on is always bridging the world of Austrian economics and Boyd, because I see so many parallels.
Right.
So didn't exist previously. So that would be an example of a snowmobile.
That is a mic drop, my friend. Such an incredible walk through the history and the epistemology of the OODA loop. And I can't tell you how many books I can't wait to buy that you've recommended. Mark, thank you so much for the time. And again, folks, LinkedIn is the place to find Mark. If you want to improve your competitive advantage and you want to turn inside somebody else's OODA loop, Mark is the guy for you.
Thanks so much, Douglas, for having me, and I look forward to chatting again soon.
Talk to you soon.
Take care.